Welcome everyone to CG webinar stroke seminar number 346, and we're going to be going to South Korea, looking at higher education in South Korea today, and we have a real expert on the country, on the higher education system. I'll introduce Hoonhui Cho in a moment. We call him Joe. Joe, I might use Joe in the webinar if that's all right. Now, let me introduce our speaker today. His topic is understanding higher education policies in South Korea. This is Hoonhui Cho. We call him Joe. He's a visiting researcher with the Center for Global Higher Education at present. He's also a senior official in the Ministry of Higher Education in the Republic of Korea, and he's been working on education policy at least since 2004 in the Korean government, and he's handled a range of responsibilities there. He completed a doctorate in the UK on the Korean state and its approaches to policy making in higher education in 2014. His research interests include higher education governance and policy, research assessment, and comparative higher education. Joe, the screen is now yours. We can see that. Thanks, Joe.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for your introduction, Simon. And I'm very happy to have a chance to talk about policy issues about South Korea. My name is Hoonhui Cho. I'm from South Korea, and I have working in the South Korean government, as Simon said. Let me start. Today, I'm going to give a very brief account on higher education policies in South Korea. In doing this, I want to suggest a proper way of understanding recent changes and policy problems that the new government has faced. Photo in the front page is of the King Sejong, who ruled the Joseon dynasty in the early 15th century. He's well known for inventing the Korean language, which we call Hangul. I think it was the most innovative creation of the entire Korean history, as it enabled a huge number of Korean people to cope with the problems they faced at the time much easier by means of educating and training them. It was certainly an educational innovation. Nowadays, more people in South Korea expect higher education institutes to become kind of platforms on which new types of innovations are made possible. I think South Korea's higher education policies base its political legitimacy on these projected imaginaries of in this presentation, I'd like to discuss the structure of discourse embodied in higher education policies, and in this way, I want to approach roles and meanings of higher education in the contemporary South Korea. The question I posed in this presentation is how policies work in the real world, and the other one is what we have to do in order to understand them better. And my approach is drawing on historical and contextual elements, as well as institutional arrangements into explaining higher education policy. University governance is defined as the constitutional forms and processes through which universities govern their affairs. But what I want to stress is that universities are not governing their own affairs in isolation, especially in South Korea. Even the daily routines of universities are largely, to a large extent, influenced by the institutional arrangements which have been formulated and developed historically. In this reason, when we approach policy issues, we need to avoid, I think we need to avoid describing only organizational structures or formal decision makings of the government. Instead, we need to attend to the complex processes of policymaking as collective puzzling and social construct, which take place in the assemblages of the Korean state. Scholars call this way of investigating policies problematization. It means the processes of defining and framing police problems in a particular way, therefore, making certain forms of organized response appropriate or essential. So, problematizing policies make two kinds of connections possible. The first connection is made between the past and the present, and then the next one is visible and something invisible. I'll begin my historical explanation with reviewing the processes of formulation and the development of higher education in South Korea. In this way, I'll focus on the relations between the Korean state and the academy specifically. The first element is the influence of Confucian traditions. Confucianism was imported in South Korea in the early years, and in the Joseon dynasty, which lasted 1392 to 1910, it became the state orthodoxy. In the neo-Confucian society, an ethic of filial piety and loyalty to social hierarchy were regarded as key moral elements maintaining social order and social stability. Even in the contemporary South Korea, social relations and activities are managed based upon the respect for authorities, and many people still believe that the government is at the peak of hierarchy. Higher education, all the higher education institutes in the pre-modern eras were public institutions run by the state. And the common goal of the institutes was teaching and training young students from upper class for their future government services. In those times, the government officials were seen as leading scholars and practitioners of Confucian ideas, as well as the heads of family clans. This shows the close associations between higher education, scholarship, and political institutions in the Confucian society. The pre-modern higher education system has been transformed since the Joseon was liberated from Japanese rule and established the South Korean government in 1948. In this period, education policy was associated with intensive processes of state formation, modernization, and economic development. Western higher education systems were imported in this period. For instance, the French model of centralized bureaucratic systems were transplanted into Korean education system during the Japanese colonial era, and it still has persisted as a dominant institutional setting. As you can see in the table, you can identify South Korean government's strong commitment towards economic development or prosperity. And the policies on higher education and its governance have been seriously influenced by the overarching national developmental project. In these circumstances, the number of higher education institutes and also their students has increased dramatically since 1980s. The growth was largely due to the expansion of private universities or specialized colleges. However, the public investment in higher education was insufficient, which put especially private universities into financial difficulty. And these conditions have led higher education institutes to be more dependent upon the state in terms of financial resources. As you can see in the first table, the number of higher education institutes in South Korea in 2021 is 426, and the university number is 202, and the number of students is up to more than 3 million. Certainly, as you can see in the table, South Korea is at the stage of mass education. In the second table, the national universities possess around 20% of higher education institutes, and they are in the big top cities in the regions. And including national universities, more than 60% of universities are in the regions. Nowadays, higher education institutes are conducting a wide range of functions, so it becomes more and more difficult to define the roles of higher education institutes in a simple way. Functional diversification of higher education is quite outstanding in South Korea. I assume that the spatial distribution and the functional diversification in the context of mass higher education have constructed a context in which certain ways of policy definitions and policy responses have been legitimized in South Korea. I think that is the takeoff point, understanding recent higher education policies announced by the new government since 2020. In this part, I divided the policy problems in higher education the South Korean government is dealing with at this government into three categories. They are regulation, funding, and assessment. And I will briefly see how each of these elements affect governing work of the university. I'll first see the examples of key regulations governing university affairs. In the early 2000s, tuition fees, university tuition fees, became a sensitive political agenda in South Korea. Many people at the time argued that university tuition fees were too high and the government should take actions to provide all students with equal opportunities for higher education, regardless of their economic backgrounds or family backgrounds. The Korean government responded to the request very quickly by increasing government budget on the state scholarships. At the same time, they also legislated a legal limitation in tuition fees. That is still working as a basic financial regulation applied to all the higher education institutions. In addition, private universities in South Korea also must fulfill four conditions of legal obligation. As you can see in the table, if higher education institutes want to select more students, they need to have more space, more academics, as well as more financial assets. The Ministry of Education has justified it as a kind of institutional safeguard for ensuring the quality of higher education. However, university argued that the uniform regulations prevented universities from trying innovations and challenges. And most of all, many people say that they are too old to work in this global age. And the new government has taken this criticism seriously into consideration. The problem with funding is quite simple. As you can see in the first graph, the government public expenditure for higher education is still not enough. In the first graph, the amount of government budget, annual budget invested to public education is much bigger than that of higher education. As you can see in the graph, the public education possesses 80% and the higher education possesses around 13 to 14%. Moreover, a revenue of public education comes from block grants, which means that local educational authorities enjoy a high level of autonomy in making their own policies. On the other hand, higher education follows an item-based budget system, which means that they are under the financial management of the Korean government. For example, Ministry of Education and Ministry of Strategic Planning and Finance. In the second graph, I divided the higher education budget of the Ministry of Education into 4 categories. The state scholarship, first category is state scholarship. It possesses the largest amount of government expenditure. I think you can understand the reason from my explanation. And the second category is the operation cost of national universities. And the third and fourth categories, highlighted with red box, are areas of conditional funding. The conditional funding has 2 streams. The first one is general financial support, and the second one is financial projects with special purpose. The first one is given to all universities once they gained qualifications in the university basic competence assessment. Although it is giving higher education institutes more freedom in using the money compared to specialized financial projects, there have been strong discontents, the conditional funding, because of the uniform assessment criteria and the workload and burden of both universities. The fourth category is financial projects with special purposes. This is given to universities based upon the competitions. So if universities want more financial aid, they need to fulfill conditions attached to funding projects. These are kind of using indirect methods in guiding higher education institutes into the goals government want to reach. From the point of government, Korean government, they are useful policy instrument triggering innovation in university governance and university affairs. But for universities, selective funding and attached conditions based upon performance assessment regarded as tools for controlling academic work. As you can see in the second graph, more than a third of government's higher education budget is allocated based on assessment. In these assessment and funding systems, dependency of higher education institutes upon the state increased inevitably. In this slide, I'll move to police brands. And you can see in the slide the conceptual framework I made of keywords. For simple explanation, I chose only 2 main policy goals and 2 policy instruments. And I will explain how each of these elements are associated in real policy making. There are a few government reports dealing with high-tech industries, but I chose the recent one, which was released in February 2023, last month. It is a joint ministerial report, and its name is Education and Human Resources Management Plans for High-Tech Industries. I think it shows well the ways in which South Korean government deal with important national policy agenda. The strategy committee chaired by the president is at the governance, and the committee clarify the directions and target areas of the policy. They mobilize series of policy tools into action, and then put more resources into these areas. Then again, the strategy committee is held on a regular basis to check the pros and cons of their work. The national policy agenda of regional innovation was included in this report. The goal is making higher education institutes regional hubs or centers that are educating and training human resources that meet the needs of local government, local industries, and local communities. To attain these goals, the Korean government proposed deregulation, empowerment, and financial support as important policy instruments. At first, the Ministry of Education announced plans for relaxing 4 conditions, and they also said to stop university-based competency assessment, and they will replace it with more flexible policy tools. In addition, the Ministry of Education plans to empower the financial authority to the local government. In this new environment, they expect the local governments and universities will work together for a regional level human resources management, for instance, strategic planning, resources distribution, and implementing custom-tailored policies and something like that. Moreover, a special account act for supporting higher education and lifelong education was enacted in 2023. As a result, as you see in the graph, the higher education budget increased sharply this year. In the press release, the Ministry of Education highlighted that they would support self-autonomous creation and innovation of universities by means of putting forward these reform measures. So far, I've discussed the structure of meanings and embodied in higher education policies of the new government, with particular emphasis on the historical development of the South Korean Academy and key institutional arrangements underpinning university governance and recent changes in policy. It was an effort to understand the meanings of policy events of the present day by referring to the history of thought and then to the processes of institutionalization, definition of policy problems, and mobilization of policy. In my opinion, the state centrality in the governing of university affairs is the spirit of institutions underpinning education in Korea. The state has been working as a rule setter and university manager and problem solver. In this reason, the government still has lots of things to do, even though the goal of the higher education policies is making university more autonomous, more free, and creative side. In other words, the one who tied the knot must untie it. In these circumstances, state-managerialist traditions are ongoing, and South Korean government might want more smarter or benevolent types of management strategies. South Korean government is still very sensitive to social and economic needs of the public, and they have administrative and financial resources that can be mobilized as comprehensive policies. And then conformity to South Korean policy is high compared to other countries. In this age of mass higher education, the roles of higher education are becoming more and more widely and deeply embedded in the fields of industries, regions, and local communities. The strategic importance of higher education is increasing. Based upon my working experiences, I'd like to say that strong public interest always generates political actions and subsequent policy measures. Because, as I said before, public imaginary is a basis of political legitimacy. Like in many other countries, the public good of higher education in South Korea leads us to reimagine the role of education. I think this is a useful and coherent point of reference in understanding the meanings of higher education in the contemporary world. Thank you for your listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was very useful, very interesting. I've got a couple of questions, and I think some questions will be coming forward soon in the chat. The relationship between educational growth and economic growth, I mean, you will have thought about this of course, the economic ministries will think about this, and it will enter into the conversation between ministries. If you look at Korea, it's notable, of course, very high rate of tertiary participation, one of the highest, if not the highest in the world consistently over the last couple of decades. And that growth of participation seemed to precede the economic takeoff of South Korea, which is also very impressive overall. That is, participation went up first before the capacity to fund participation at the contemporary level. Whereas we compare that to other countries, it's been sometimes been the reverse sequence. China, for example, saw its economy start to take off in the 80s, and originally in the rural sector, all of that swinging into the urban and the export zones 10 years later. But participation in tertiary education doesn't start to take off really till the mid-1990s. The US case, both seem to advance more or less simultaneously, with the US being the first mass tertiary education system really before Second World War, I suppose, but the economic capacity already established earlier. And then in the post-war period, they both seem to advance simultaneously. What's your thinking? I mean, your own judgment as now an expert as well as a senior government official on higher education. Does higher education drive economic growth? Does economic growth drive higher education growth? Or is it a combination, or does it vary by country eclectically?
I think it's half and half, I think, if I say the result first, my response first. And before, I think it was clear, and before in the developmental era, the skilled workers, like skilled workers who were educated in the public schools and universities, work as like a fundamental basis of economic development is true, and because and then that was possible because industries was quite simple at the time, but nowadays I cannot say for sure that higher education in current situations, higher education can be the precedent elements in economic development, because our economy is becoming complex quite a lot. So higher education and education system exchange is quite slow, I think. So I cannot say that for sure.
I've got one more question before we bring in a number of people who already indicated they want to ask questions. It's in relation to vocational and technical education as distinct from the academic universities. Has a strong vocational sector developed in South Korea? Does it attract families? Does it attract student demand and family demand? How prestigious is it in relation compared to the academic universities?
If you see the slide, that there is a category of a specialized college. It is a 2-year or 3-year higher education institutes, which focus mainly on the vocational education and skill development. And I have to admit that there is a hierarchy in South Korean higher education institutes, in which the top-ranking university, which pursue research universities, are quite respected, and many people want to the university, Seoul National Universities. But for example, lifelong learners, adult learners, they need reskilling, and then they need to come back to university or higher education after working for some years. So there certainly exists the kind of new demands for higher education, and it is they usually go to vocational education and upskilling and these things like that. And so these demands grow in recent years, certainly. So I think that new types of demands are emerging in this area.
Thanks, Joe. Now I'm going to bring in Aki Yanazawa. Aki from Tohoku in Japan. Aki, are you there, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very the comprehensive explanation about what is going on now. And especially I'm very impressed about the very strong commitment of the industry. And this is really, we are also actually seeking the possibility in our country, Japan. And my question is that I have some general impression that the South Korean higher education policy has changed drastically with the change of the kind of a series of presidency. And also your explanation today is much more like some kind of a developmental stage type discussion that under the facing the kind of different stage that this kind of a higher education policy was taken. So, for example, take a case of the tuition fee, and it seems that my impression that in the beginning the tuition fee of the private higher education was relatively higher than the neighboring country like Japan, considering the consuming prices. But after that, you had a very drastic policy to stop the increasing, and then again you are discussing the kind of the alternatives. So how can we understand the two different drive that the policy changes with the presidential changes and some kind of the very consistent pursuit of the relationship between the economic development and the higher education? That is my question.
Compared to previous government, this new government emphasized the growth of the economy, and it is different political they have compared to previous government. Is true, and in this sense, the current government tried to incorporate other sectors of the government into the economic development, like as I said, to serving to the development of high-tech industries and cutting-edge industries and regional development and something like that. I know it is true that this government is quite strong, has quite strong commitment on corporate development. And also, this is done by freeing economic actors and universities from regulations. But on the other hand, the tuition fees limitation are still ongoing. This is complex the situation in which South Korean policies are situated, I think. I cannot say we can easily lift up the regulation because, as I said before, the public interest to certain issues is the basis of political legitimacy. So from our experiences, we cannot say that, okay, we will lift up all the regulations about tuition fees. We cannot say that easily. So I think it's the kind of mixed picture of the policies in the context of
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, both. I'm sorry, Aki, we'll have to move on, and we've got quite a lot of questions coming up. David James is next.
Thank you. Thank you for that really interesting talk. I've got two questions, but I'll only ask one of them because we've got other people want to come in. I'm interested to know, not having read this report you mentioned yet, the recent one, February 2023. How would you describe the South Korean government's sort of broad intentions as involving higher education in a perhaps a large sea change towards digital innovation and/or new technologies and/or AI? Is that sort of the tone of the government's ambitions for higher education that comes through in this policy?
The digital technology and high-tech industries are just only part of higher education. If we think of the entire areas of higher education, and then, as I said before, this is a very brief and selective account on higher education policy in Korea, which I picked the focus of policies. And South Korean government tried to approach it in the perspective of human resources management. And then they split the roles of government and the roles of the universities. And then in approaching that, South Korean government tried to provide resources required in fostering skilled workers in the education in the field of education. For example, South Korean government decided to the limitation of food and water in high-tech related studies, and that means that if some universities want to invest more on the high-tech and related studies, they can select more students. They can put more resources on it. This is the outcomes of deregulations. So there is a two tracks: deregulation and put more resources on it. And then South Korean government trying to make just a management system in terms of human resources management. It's like a distant management from. So we try to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Joe. Next question is from Futa Huang.
Thank you, and I'm Futa Huang from Hiroshima University, Japan. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. I have several questions. First, are there any gaps between the ideal of higher education policies and the social changes in Korea in recent years? Because in the time, I do not ask you, are there any gaps between the ideal higher education policies and social changes since the post-World War, end of Second World War? Just for the last, for example, decade or last 10 years, this is the first question. Or are there any unintended outcomes of higher education policies, such as unexpected benefits, unexpected drawback, or perverse results? If any, how did your government or your governments close the gap or deal with these unintended consequences of higher education policies? This is first set of questions. Second, how environmental changes such as the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, new nationalism, and changing geopolitics have affected formation of and changes in recent higher education policy in your country? And my final question is, can you talk a little more about the new directions for higher education policies in Korea? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for your question at first, and then I think I need to split the question because to be honest, I can understand all of your questions. And the first one is the gap or unintended consequences that will follow. Is that right? But can you explain it a little bit more? I'm so sorry.
I'm writing my question in the chat box. The first is about any gaps between the ideal of higher education policies and social changes in the country for the last decade or for the last decades, or any unintended outcomes or consequences such as unexpected benefits, unexpected drawback, or perverse. Normally there are gaps. Normally there are some unintended consequences or outcomes of policies or regulations. I think this is one of the classic questions
Yeah.
raised by sociologists.
Oh yeah. The government policy itself in nature is kind of leverage, which is made to push forward the field into the direction they want to go. So it's basically quite indirect way of controlling a field. So the main methods of controlling universities in South Korea was regulations. Regulation is usually done by law and enforcement decrees, and they are in nature applied all the university at the same time without exception. That was the main problems inherent in South Korea's management technologies. So that's why this government tried to lift up the regulations as many as possible. That was because they can generate unintended outcomes, as you said, in the higher education. And then they also oppress the challenging works and creativity and innovations. So it's like controlling, social control. It can be a major tool of rather than boosting up creativity. And the other question, please.
Yeah,
Joe,
you have-
Joe, I've posted them in the chat box. You can see Futao's questions.
and the second question, how the changing context of environmental changes such as COVID-19 pandemic, new nationalism, and the changing geopolitics have affected the formation of and the changes in your new higher education policies.
COVID-19 has constructed a new landscape of higher education. Is quite right, and then there is a growing concerns that we need to overcome spatial location and then traditional ways of university sites and something like that. As I said before in this presentation, with South Korean government tried to relax 4 conditions. In there is conditions about school buildings and facilities and school lands, school estates. We try to relax it because we need to meet the needs of new education. It's a mixture of the combination of online and offline education, isn't it? So we need to follow the trends of higher education. That was the of the regulation. And then nationalism.
New nationalism and the change in geopolitics. I mean, the intense relationship between China and the United States.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by the term new nationalism, but in terms of it, South Korean government tried to make national prosperity, and then in this process, many people think that the individual rights can be a little bit can be resolved for the sake of public interest. If we think the kind of trends as nationalism, the nationalistic trends is still ongoing in South Korea. So it is like traditional practices in making policies.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thanks, Futao. They're very interesting questions. We'll let them run for a little while. Paula is next. Paula Lim, come in, please.
Thanks, Simon. And my question, sorry, just going to scroll up to it in the chat here, essentially is about tuition fee freezes, which have been in place for, I think, 14 years now in Korea. And earlier this year, we saw that a number of institutions broke ranks with the tuition fee freeze and have raised their tuitions for students. So I guess I'm just wondering whether you think that the government should abandon its policy to keep tuition frozen, given that it looks like increasing numbers of universities in Korea are going to not really respect the freeze anymore anyway.
Yeah, it's true. South Korean government tried to lift up all the unnecessary regulations, including fees, and then they in the process of presidential campaign, tuition fee relaxation was discussed. But this is, I think, this is still under consideration and deliberation, because this is quite a sensitive and political issue. We need to deal with it very carefully. You know, in these days, the market conditions are quite bad, you know, as you know. So the tuition fees are quite increased. The effect influence the level of inflation, as you know well. So I can say that South Korean government is approaching to this issue very carefully, but tries to lift it as early as. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Yes, thanks, Paula, and thanks, Joe, again. Our next question is from Gertrude Cotter. Hello, Gertrude. Hello, Gertrude. We might move on to Konstantin Julin. Konstantin, are you there, please?
Hi, yeah. Thank you very much for the super interesting talk. I would like to ask if you could elaborate more on which role do financial markets play in higher education funding in Korea? Like, for instance, which role do endowments play? Are there any private higher education providers who are publicly traded, like in Brazil? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you very much.
So did you ask me the role of financial market to higher education?
Exactly.
So which aspect are you asking? I'm sorry. Which aspect of financial markets are you referring to?
So I was wondering if there are any higher education institutions who issue bonds, for instance, to fund research or instructions. Are there any private providers of higher education who are publicly traded?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite. I don't know the field much, so I cannot give you a proper answer at this moment. I'm so sorry about that.
Not a problem. Thank you anyway.
Yeah, I think it's about a question about loans financing and also the role of equity investment and you know, whether private providers are profit making for their shareholders and those sorts of things. How capitalist is private education in South Korea? I think that's the question. I'm going to and Gertrude Cotter's question we might get back to in the chat later, but let me bring in more people who are coming on camera. Simon Chattopadhyay, can you come in, please, Simon?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Professor Martinson, and very comprehensive presentation. I'm just curious to know, I'm trying to understand the entire policy landscape in the context of South Korea. My first question is, are the privately funded institutions allowed to make profit? And I'm also curious to know about the research funding. On what basis and who is the funding agency? for allocating research funds among the institutions, right? And you have already talked about regulation, so you can skip that question. But the last question is that, is the faculty regulated? What is the scope for autonomy? Autonomy is being broadly conceptualized in this. I mean, is it of new public management type when the faculty is being regulated? Or is there any conflict between faculty regulation and the way the institutions are regulated by the regulating body? Thank you very much.
I think for your question first, and then regarding research funding, there are lots of government departments supporting research in various areas. And many of research funds are supported by the Ministry of Education. And there are large amount of funding, and large areas are supported, including human arts and humanities, and then basic science and something like that. And R&D, research and development funds are managed by Ministry of Science and Technology, and they are overlapping areas in between Ministry of Education and Ministry of Science and Technology. They are two big pillars of research. And then there are public agency, public organization implementing and planning research funding in South Korea. They are called National Foundation of Research and the Research Foundation and implements and planning, and then choose who the recipients of the funds. And then what was your next question?
I think I'm just curious to know how faculty is regulated. I mean, is the funding, the regulating body really concerned about the faculty autonomy? Is it being talked about in the context of country? I mean, a broad view of how the faculty is regulated, in case the faculty is regulated at all. Yeah.
The management of faculty is basically free. We don't have any regulations about that. But as I said before, if the government sees something as important policy goals and policy targets, governments can use financial aid as a leverage to make universities move. So, for example, the cooperation between universities and industries, we can put government investment to universities, and instead we can say that, can you just reflect, can you just see the needs of industry in your curriculum? Like, for example, inviting professors from the high-tech universities, high-tech industries to universities, and then make a test of tailored curriculums and something like that. So there are dual tracks in managing universities, and the basic university governance is free and autonomous and self-governing. And then if we need something to university do, we can.
Thank you very much.
And thank you both. Let me pass quickly now to Connor O'Reilly, please.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. One of the biggest, most significant issues that you read about in the papers in Korea at the moment is demographic issues with the less and less students entering universities. And this is exacerbated, I think, by there's always been a high level of Korean students traveling overseas, and also the hierarchy of the urban universities, especially the Seoul universities. And as you pointed out, there's 200 universities in Seoul, and the population is smaller than the UK. So there's a huge number of universities. To what extent, will these policy developments, especially in terms of the funding, because I think the funding is there to keep a lot of the universities afloat. To what extent will it kind of address or combat or help these demographic challenges?
Thank you for your question, and this is a very important question, I think. Demographic change because of low birth rate is quite a serious problems, and demographic change influence the collapse of regional community effort. Because in South Korea, more and more students want to join top-ranking university located in Seoul and capital city. So this is the problem. So we need to make regional universities, for example, more attractive in terms of planning and scaling. So we try to put more resources to the regional universities, as I said before. That's the first track of response. And then the other one is make a closer connection between local community and local industries with universities. Because the adult learners always need new types of skills and new types of needs to required to live in this lifelong learning society, because life expectancy is prolonged and they need to learn new technologies, new skills. So I think new customers of regional universities can be the adult learners with affiliation within the local industries and local communities. They can make new areas of interest of universities. I think that can be the alternatives, and they can be the answers in this demographic change.
Yeah, we're running down to the end now, Joe. The last question on my list is Soyoung Lee. And Soyoung, just before you come in, let me mention Gertrude Cotter's question as well, which was in the chat. That question is, are the arts and humanities well supported in South Korea? So you can answer Gertrude and answer Soyoung, who's about to give her question. Soyoung.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to ask a question about the side effects or problems related to the main focus on human resource management in higher education policy in South Korea. It is very understandable why it is internationally praised that South Korean universities and its rapid economic development are highly related, and why people are really focused on human resources development and management in that country. But I also would like to hear some side effects or problems related to that, like too much focus on human resources. And yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Your question is related to the problems in art and humanities we cannot support every area of policy customers equally. So if we focus on certain areas of our economy and our society, and in the other hand, some areas and somebody will be marginalized. It happen. So I think that we need to be careful, and we need to be careful in dealing with this equality of higher education and then areas of it. So even though I didn't mention about art and humanities, South Korean government in terms of academic research, supporting academic research, art and humanities funds, the fund for art and humanities fund increased a lot this year. It's made by the special contract and made by special contract enacted this year. So we try to make balance between the areas of this.
Look, thanks very much, Joe. I must have muddied the water slightly by bringing in the arts and humanities question at the same time as Seong, which I think Seong was pointing in the same direction, but perhaps asking a slightly more broader question than Gertrude. But anyway, we've reached the end, the time when the silver coach turns into a pumpkin at 3 o'clock UK time. Joe, this was not the best attended webinar, but the questions and discussion were magnificent, as was your presentation. I'm sure that we'll have a lot of use of the video on YouTube. You've informed everyone a great deal, I think, about higher education in South Korea, and a country which is most interesting to many of us because of its modern accomplishments, especially in higher education and science and innovation. And we look forward to seeing everyone at our next CG webinar, which is on Tuesday, and we have Marek Quick back again, talking to us about big data and women and men in global science. Marek's presentation's always very interesting, so do come along and take part on Tuesday next week. Once again, Joe, thank you very, very much. Hoonhui, Joe, your contribution very good today, and we look forward to seeing you again. We understand your period of leave from the ministry and study at Oxford will go on until the end of this year, so we would hope that we'll have at least one more webinar from you before you go back. Thanks everyone for attending, and I must say then bye for now.